Hey guys, tonight we travel back to the 19th century, to an age of steam, steel, and startling progress, the Victorian era, a time of grand empires, bustling factories, and an unshakable belief in the forward march of civilization. But beneath the polished veneer of propriety and invention, there was another world, a world of shadows, superstition, and science so strange it borders on fantasy. We're venturing into the bizarre world of Victorian medicine. Here, we'll find cures more dangerous than the diseases they treated, surgeries performed with terrifying speed, and theories about the human body that came from a place of profound and often fatal misunderstanding. If this kind of storytelling helps you unwind, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it truly brings you peace. So get comfortable, dim the lights, and let the sounds of our modern world fade. We are about to enter a time when a doctor's visit was as much a gamble as it was a cure. To truly understand Victorian medicine, we must first understand the world that created it. The 19th century was an age of breathtaking contradictions. On one hand, you had the explosive growth of the Industrial Revolution. Great iron ships crossed the oceans, steam trains carved their way across continents, and cities like London and Manchester became sprawling hubs of production and wealth. There was a palpable sense of optimism, a belief that humanity, through science and engineering, could conquer any challenge. Yet, this gleaming facade of progress cast a very long and very dark shadow. The very cities that symbolized Victorian power were also breeding grounds for disease. Millions flocked from the countryside to work in the new factories, crowding into poorly built slums with no proper sanitation. Entire districts lacked clean drinking water or effective sewer systems. The River Thames in London, for example, was an open sewer, a thick, brown soup of human waste and industrial pollution. In this environment, disease flourished. Cholera, a terrifying illness that could kill in a matter of hours, swept through cities in devastating epidemics. Typhoid fever was rampant. And then there was consumption, or tuberculosis, a slow, wasting disease that became so common it was almost a part of the cultural landscape. In this world of steam and steel, a simple cough could be a death sentence, and the very air was thought to carry deadly poisons. The desperate need for cures was immense, but it existed in a world where the true enemy, the germ, was still an invisible, unknown phantom. So, in this age of progress and pestilence, who would you turn to for help? You would summon the Victorian doctor. He was typically a man of a certain class, a gentleman who carried himself with an air of authority and confidence. His training was a strange mixture of old and new. He would have studied the ancient Greek theories of the four humors, believing that health depended on the balance of blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. At the same time, he would be fascinated by the new sciences of chemistry and biology, eager to try the latest chemical compounds and theories. There were no real standards for medical education. Anyone could call themselves a doctor, leading to a wild variation in skill and knowledge. When the doctor arrived at your bedside, he would carry a black leather bag filled with the tools of his trade. Inside, you might find lancets and cups for bloodletting, jars of leeches, and a stethoscope, a relatively new invention. You would also find an array of powerful and often dangerous drugs, bottles of laudanum, a mixture of opium and alcohol, powders containing mercury, and syrups laced with cocaine or even heroin were all part of his arsenal. He was a figure of immense authority, a warrior ready to battle death itself. The tragedy, however, was that in his profound ignorance of germs and his misplaced faith in poisonous cures. His best efforts were often just as dangerous as the diseases he was trying to fight. Let's now open his medical bag and take a closer look at the bizarre and terrifying world of his practice. Let us first look at one of the most enduring and unsettling practices in the Victorian medical toolkit, bloodletting. This wasn't a new invention. It was an ancient tradition, stretching back to the time of Hippocrates in ancient Greece. The core belief was in the theory of the four humors, the idea that the human body was composed of four essential fluids: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. A healthy person had these humors in perfect balance. Sickness, therefore, was simply a sign that one of the humors was in excess, and for centuries, the most common culprit was believed to be an excess of blood. The solution seemed obvious: remove some. So, if you were a Victorian suffering from almost any ailment, a fever, a headache, pneumonia, even a fit of melancholy, it was highly likely your doctor would prescribe a bleeding. There were two primary methods. The first was venesection, which involved the doctor taking a small, sharp blade called a lancet and making a precise cut into a vein, usually in the patient's arm, allowing the blood to drain into a bowl. The doctor would watch the quantity and even the color of the blood carefully, believing it told them something about the nature of the illness. The second, and perhaps more iconic method, was the use of leeches. The apothecary or doctor would keep these medicinal creatures in large glass jars, and their application was a common sight in the sick room. A number of leeches would be placed on the patient's skin, where they would latch on and begin to draw blood, swelling up as they fed. It was considered a gentler, more localized form of bleeding. For the patient, however, the experience was anything but gentle. The practice often left them weaker and more vulnerable than before, draining their already depleted strength. It was a cure born of ancient theory, applied with Victorian confidence, a perfect and terrifying example of a medicine that did more harm than good. If the doctor's direct interventions weren't enough, the Victorian era offered another path to questionable health: the patent medicine. This was the age of the cure-all, the rise of the beautifully packaged, mass-marketed bottle of hope that promised to remedy everything from a nagging cough to a nervous disposition. These medicines required no prescription, and their ingredients were often a closely guarded and deeply alarming secret. The most respectable chemists and the most dubious traveling salesmen all sold these potent concoctions. One of the most shocking examples came from the German pharmaceutical company, Bayer. At the very end of the Victorian era, they began marketing a new wonder drug, a supposedly non-addictive cough suppressant that was said to be far safer than morphine. They called it heroin. It was sold over the counter in syrup form and was widely prescribed for adults with coughs and colds. But the soothing syrups weren't just for adults. Countless products, like the infamous Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, were marketed directly to mothers for their teething or colicky infants. These syrups promised a quiet baby and a peaceful night's sleep, and they delivered because they were often loaded with morphine or opium. A dose of soothing syrup could calm a child, but it could also lead to coma, addiction, or even death. In a world without regulation, the family medicine cabinet was often one of the most dangerous places in the Victorian home. Beyond the opiates that soothed coughs and quieted children, the Victorian doctor's arsenal contained substances that were, by any definition, potent poisons. In an age before antibiotics, doctors were desperately searching for something that could attack disease inside the body. They turned to the world of chemistry and metallurgy. and two elements in particular became mainstays of the Victorian pharmacopoeia: mercury and arsenic. These heavy metals were known to be toxic, but it was believed that in small, controlled doses, their toxic properties could be harnessed to kill a disease before they killed the patient. It was a dangerous and often tragic gamble. Mercury, in a compound called calomel, was a shockingly common prescription. It was a powerful laxative and was given for an astonishing range of ailments, from constipation and fevers to teething in infants. The idea was to violently purge the body of the bad humors believed to cause the illness. Patients would suffer through intense bouts of vomiting and diarrhea, which the doctor interpreted as a sign the cure was working. In reality, it was a sign of mercury poisoning. The long-term effects were devastating. Patients could suffer from neurological damage, tooth loss, and disfigurement of the jaw. Arsenic, a poison famous for its use by assassins, was also found in respectable medicine. It was a key ingredient in Fowler's solution, a tonic prescribed for everything from asthma to cancer. Because arsenic can stimulate the appetite and give a temporary sense of well-being, it was seen as a restorative cure. Women also used arsenic-laced wafers and creams as a cosmetic, hoping to achieve the pale, delicate complexion that was fashionable at the time. They were, in essence, slowly poisoning themselves for the sake of beauty. The faith placed in these deadly substances is a chilling testament to the desperation of the era. With few effective weapons against disease, doctors were willing to fight fire with fire, even if the cure was a poison in a bottle. Let us now step away from the medicine cabinet and enter one of the most feared places in the Victorian world, the operating theater. Before the middle of the 19th century, surgery was not the meticulous, life-saving discipline we know today. It was a brutal, terrifying last resort, a desperate battle against death itself, fought not with precision, but with sheer, breathtaking speed. Without any effective way to dull the patient's pain, the single most important quality of a surgeon was not his knowledge or his delicacy, but how fast he could work. Imagine the scene. The patient, often wide awake and lucid, would be brought into a room crowded with onlookers. These were not sterile environments. They were lecture halls, with tiers of seats filled with students and fellow doctors, all eager to witness the bloody spectacle. The patient would be held down, or strapped to a heavy wooden table, by several strong assistants. There was no solace, no gentle countdown, only the sharp, metallic sound of the surgeon selecting his instruments. The surgeon himself was a figure of grim authority. He would roll up his sleeves, perhaps put on an apron already stiff with the dried blood of previous operations, a gruesome badge of honor, and announce his intentions. Then the race began. The air would be filled with the patient's screams as the surgeon worked with a terrifying, frantic energy. A leg amputation, one of the most common major surgeries, could be completed in under a minute by a master surgeon like Robert Liston, who was famous for his almost inhuman speed. He would cut through flesh and muscle with a large knife, saw through bone with powerful, rapid strokes, and then toss the severed limb aside before quickly stitching the stump. Speed was everything, because the prolonged agony of the procedure could send the patient into fatal shock. It was a performance of butchery, a horrifying spectacle where survival was measured in seconds. For the patient, it was an experience of unimaginable terror, a waking nightmare from which there was no escape. The operating theater was not a place of healing. It was a chamber of horrors. For centuries, the agonizing screams from the operating theater were an accepted, if horrifying, part of medicine. The search for a way to conquer surgical pain was long and fraught with desperate, often dangerous, experiments. Doctors tried everything from opium and alcohol to mesmerism, and even compressing the nerves of the limb to be operated on. Nothing truly worked. Then, in the mid-1840s, everything changed. The dawn of the age of anesthesia arrived, not with a grand announcement, but in the quiet experiments of a few dentists and doctors in America. The first breakthrough came with ether, a sweet-smelling chemical compound. In 1846, a dentist named William T. G. Morton gave a public demonstration at Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston. He administered ether vapor to a patient, who then underwent the removal of a tumor from his neck without showing any sign of pain. The surgeon, who had initially been skeptical, turned to the stunned audience and famously declared, "Gentlemen, this is no humbug." The news spread like wildfire across the Atlantic. For the first time in human history, the promise of painless surgery was a reality. Shortly after, a Scottish obstetrician named James Young Simpson discovered the anesthetic properties of another chemical chloroform. He found it to be faster acting and more pleasant for the patient than ether. However, its adoption was not without controversy. Some religious critics argued that pain, especially the pain of childbirth, was ordained by God and should not be interfered with. But the new discovery gained its ultimate seal of approval in 1853 when Queen Victoria herself chose to use chloroform during the birth of her eighth child, Prince Leopold. Her endorsement silenced many of the critics and cemented anesthesia's place in modern medicine. The age of screaming was over. The era of silent, meticulous surgery had begun, transforming one of the most terrifying experiences imaginable into a state of peaceful oblivion. It was, without exaggeration, one of the greatest leaps forward in the history of human compassion. Even with the miraculous arrival of anesthesia, the surgeon's primary solution for a badly damaged limb remained the same: amputation. For much of the Victorian era, before a deep understanding of infection and antibiotics, a severe compound fracture, a deeply embedded bullet, or a joint ravaged by tuberculosis was often a death sentence if left alone. Gangrene could set in, and the infection would spread throughout the body, leading to a slow and agonizing death. In this context, amputation wasn't a barbaric choice. It was often the only choice, a brutal but necessary act to save the patient's life. The operating theater, now quieted by the peaceful slumber of chloroform, became the domain of the amputation specialist. The ideal procedure was known as a good, clean cut. With the patient now still and unconscious, the surgeon was freed from the tyranny of speed. He could take his time, no longer needing to complete the operation in a frantic minute. This allowed for more refined techniques. There were two main styles. The first was the circular amputation, where the surgeon would make a single, continuous cut through the skin and muscle around the limb. He would then retract the skin and muscle to expose the bone, which he would saw through at a higher point. This created a cuff of soft tissue that could be pulled over the exposed bone stump, like a purse string, creating a neater, more easily healed wound. The second method was the flap amputation. Here, the surgeon would carve out one or two large flaps of skin and muscle, cutting down to the bone from one side. He would then saw through the bone and fold these flaps over the stump, stitching them together to create a more padded and durable end. This was considered particularly useful for leg amputations, as it created a better surface for a future prosthetic, a wooden leg. While the new, silent operating theater was a world away from the screaming chaos of the pre-anesthetic era, The grim reality of the procedure remained. The surgeon, still in his blood-stained apron, would work methodically, the sharp rasp of the bone saw, now the most prominent sound in the room. The severed limb would be tossed into a waiting bucket. And the patient, though spared the pain, would awaken to a new and permanent reality, their body forever altered by the surgeon's life-saving knife. Anesthesia had solved the problem of pain, but it had unintentionally unmasked another, more insidious killer. Now that surgeons could take their time, they could perform longer, more complex operations deep within the body. But a terrible pattern emerged. A patient might survive a brilliant operation, only to die a few days later from a raging fever and a mysterious, creeping rot that blackened the wound. This was known as hospital gangrene, or surgical fever, and it was the scourge of the Victorian hospital. We now know this was septicemia, or blood poisoning, caused by massive bacterial infection. But in the mid-19th century, the cause was a complete mystery. The operating theater, despite its scientific aspirations, was a breeding ground for death. Surgeons rarely washed their hands or their instruments between operations. They would move from dissecting a corpse in the anatomy lab directly to performing surgery on a living patient, carrying unseen microbes with them. The surgeon's operating coat was a point of pride. It was rarely washed, and the more it was caked with old, dried blood and pus, the more it was seen as a testament to his experience and skill, a horrifying badge of honor. Instruments were often stored in velvet-lined cases, which were porous and impossible to properly clean. Surgical sponges were used on one patient, rinsed in a bowl of murky water, and then used on the next. The very air in the hospital ward, crowded with sick and dying patients, was thick with what they called miasma, but what was, in reality, a fog of deadly bacteria. As a result, mortality rates after surgery were appallingly high. A patient had a better chance of surviving an amputation performed on their own kitchen table than in the most prestigious city hospital. The operating theater had been silenced of screams, but it was now haunted by the quiet, creeping terror of the unseen killer infection. Into this world of invisible death stepped a quiet, methodical Quaker surgeon named Joseph Lister, working in Glasgow in the 1860s. Lister was deeply troubled by the horrifying number of his patients who died from infection after otherwise successful surgeries. He was a meticulous surgeon, but like his colleagues, he was losing patients to the mysterious hospital gangrene. However, Lister had been reading the groundbreaking work of a French chemist named Louis Pasteur. Pasteur had recently demonstrated that invisible microorganisms, or germs, were responsible for fermentation and decay. Lister had a revolutionary thought. What if these same germs were also responsible for the decay he was seeing in his patients' wounds? It was a brilliant leap of logic. If germs were the enemy, then the solution was to kill them before they could enter the body. He needed a chemical weapon, an antiseptic. He found his answer in carbolic acid, a substance derived from coal tar that was being used at the time to treat sewage. Lister began to experiment. He insisted on washing his hands with a carbolic acid solution before surgery. He cleaned his instruments with it. He even soaked the surgical dressings in it. Most famously, he developed a device that would spray a fine mist of carbolic acid into the air throughout the operating theater, aiming to kill any germs that might be floating in the dreaded miasma. The results were astonishing. In Lister's wards, the mortality rate from post-surgical infection plummeted. Patients who would have certainly died just a few years earlier were now surviving and making full recoveries. But the medical establishment was not quick to embrace his ideas. Many prominent surgeons scoffed at the notion of invisible germs, dismissing it as a fanciful theory. They resented the suggestion that they, the esteemed gentlemen of their profession, were the ones carrying death on their unwashed hands. They complained that the carbolic acid was irritating to the skin and that the spray was cumbersome. For years, Lister fought an uphill battle, promoting his antiseptic system in the face of widespread ridicule. But the evidence was undeniable. His patients lived, while others died. Slowly, reluctantly, the world began to accept the truth. The invisible killer had been unmasked, and the age of antiseptic surgery had begun. Before Joseph Lister and Louis Pasteur could convince the world of their revolutionary germ theory, another, far older idea held powerful sway over the Victorian mind, the miasma theory. For centuries, it was the dominant explanation for how disease spread. The theory was simple, intuitive, and, to the people living in the stench of a 19th century city, it made perfect sense. It held that diseases like cholera, typhoid, and the plague were not spread by invisible organisms, but by miasma, a form of bad air that rose from rotting organic matter. This foul air, it was believed, could be identified by its horrible smell. Imagine walking through the streets of Victorian London. The air would be thick with the smell of coal smoke, unwashed bodies, horse manure, and the raw, untreated sewage that often flowed in open gutters. The River Thames itself was a putrid, stinking mess. When an epidemic broke out, it often did so in the poorest, most crowded, and smelliest parts of the city. To the people of the time, the connection was obvious: foul smells equal disease. It was a sensory diagnosis. If a place smelled of death and decay, it was believed that the air itself was poisoned and could infect anyone who breathed it in. This theory, while incorrect, was not entirely without benefit. It spurred on many of the great Victorian sanitation reformers. Believing that cleaning up the filth would eliminate the bad smells and therefore the disease, they campaigned for cleaner streets, better housing, and, most importantly, the development of comprehensive sewer systems. They were fighting the right battle, but for the wrong reason. They thought they were eliminating a poisonous vapor, when in fact they were accidentally eliminating the contaminated water and waste in which the real killers, bacteria and viruses, were breeding. The fear of miasma was a powerful motivator, a tangible, smellable enemy in the fight against an invisible plague. It was a deeply flawed theory, but one that would paradoxically lead to some of the greatest public health advances of the era. In the midst of the great miasma debate, as London choked on its own stench, one quiet physician named Dr. John Snow began to suspect that the theory of bad air was fundamentally wrong. Snow was a brilliant and doggedly logical investigator, and during the terrifying cholera outbreak of 1854 in the Soho district of London, he saw an opportunity to test his own, very different hypothesis that cholera was not spread by air, but by contaminated water. The outbreak was sudden and devastating. In the space of just a few days, hundreds of people in a small area of Soho died a horrible, rapid death, while others blamed the local foul-smelling sewer lines. Snow began a meticulous investigation that would become a landmark in the history of public health. He went from house to house, interviewing the families of the deceased. He asked them not about the smells in their homes, but a simple, crucial question: where did they get their water? He began to plot the deaths on a map of the neighborhood, marking each fatality with a small black bar. As he worked, a clear and undeniable pattern began to emerge. The deaths were not randomly distributed, nor were they clustered around the smelliest parts of the district. Instead, they were overwhelmingly concentrated around a single public water pump on Broad Street. Snow's investigation uncovered telling clues. There was a local workhouse with over 500 inmates that had suffered almost no deaths. He discovered they had their own private well. A nearby brewery had likewise been spared. The owner told Snow that his workers were given a daily ration of beer and rarely drank water from the local pumps. The most tragic proof came from the case of a widow who had moved away from Soho, but had so loved the taste of the water from the Broad Street pump that she had a servant bring it to her home in Hampstead every day. She and her niece, who also drank the water, both died of cholera, the only two cases in that part of London. Armed with this overwhelming data, Snow went before the local parish authorities and pleaded with them to disable the pump. Skeptical, but faced with Snow's relentless logic and his powerful, chilling map, they agreed to remove the pump handle. Almost immediately, the outbreak in Soho began to subside, though it would be years before the world fully accepted that a microscopic organism in the water, not a foul miasma, was the true killer. Snow's work was a revolutionary moment. He had, through pure epidemiological detective work, unmasked the real culprit and proven that the source of a deadly plague could be as simple and as overlooked as a single pump handle. Even with Dr. Snow's brilliant detective work, the miasma theory did not die easily. It took a crisis of monumental and monumentally smelly proportions to finally force the hand of a paralyzed government. That crisis came in the summer of 1858, a season that would go down in London's history as the Great Stink. The summer was unusually hot and dry, causing the water level of the River Thames to drop dramatically. For centuries, the Thames had been the city's dumping ground. All of its raw sewage, industrial waste, and refuse from slaughterhouses flowed directly into the river, which was also, paradoxically, a primary source of drinking water for many. In the blistering heat of 1858, this centuries-old sludge began to cook. The river transformed into a thick, putrid, fermenting sewer. The stench that rose from its banks was not just unpleasant, it was a physical, overpowering assault on the senses. It was described as a combination of every foul smell imaginable. A toxic fog that permeated every corner of the city. People walking near the river would hold handkerchiefs soaked in perfume to their faces, and there were reports of men fainting from the sheer noxious power of the smell. The Great Stink was not just a public nuisance. It was a national crisis because the magnificent, newly rebuilt Houses of Parliament stood right on the riverbank. The politicians and lawmakers who had for years debated and delayed action on sanitation were now trapped by the very problem they had ignored. They tried to soak the curtains of Parliament in chloride of lime to mask the smell, but it was useless. The stench was so overwhelming that they could barely conduct their business. It was a moment of profound, almost comical, irony. Faced with the choice of either abandoning the capital or finally solving the problem, Parliament was forced into action. In a frantic session lasting just 18 days, they passed a bill authorizing the creation of one of the greatest engineering feats of the age, a massive, modern sewer system for London, designed by the brilliant engineer Joseph Bazalgette. They may have been acting on the flawed miasma theory, believing they were defeating bad air, but in doing so, they inadvertently saved countless future lives from waterborne diseases, all thanks to a smell so terrible it brought a government to its knees. While diseases like cholera inspired terror, another, slower-moving killer captured the Victorian imagination in a strange and unsettling way: tuberculosis, known then as consumption. It was an illness that seemed to prey on the young, the artistic, and the beautiful. And in a bizarre twist of cultural perception, its devastating symptoms came to be seen as signs of tragic beauty and heightened sensitivity. Consumption was not just a disease, it became a romantic ideal. The illness caused a slow, gradual wasting away of the body. Sufferers became thin and pale, their skin almost translucent. They would have a low-grade, persistent fever that gave their cheeks a delicate, feverish flush, and their eyes often appeared larger and brighter. In an age that valued fragility and ethereal beauty, especially in women, these horrifying symptoms were reinterpreted as aesthetically pleasing. The consumptive patient was seen as being too pure, too sensitive for this world. They were thought to possess a heightened artistic or spiritual nature, as if the disease were burning away their coarse, earthly shell to reveal the brilliant soul within. This romantic notion permeated the art and literature of the time. The heroines of operas like Verdi's La Traviata and Puccini's La Bohème are beautiful, tragic consumptives who sing their most passionate arias as they fade away. Poets like John Keats, who himself died of the disease, became symbols of the tragic, consumptive genius. This romanticism stood in stark, horrifying contrast to the grim reality of the illness. Consumption was a miserable disease, characterized by racking, bloody coughs, drenching night sweats, and a slow, suffocating decline. Yet, for a time, society chose to see not the suffering, but the sentiment. It was a strange and poignant coping mechanism, a way of finding beauty in the face of one of the era's most relentless and incurable killers. If the world of Victorian medicine was bizarre for men, it was often a landscape of profound and systemic misunderstanding for women. Female health was viewed through a lens of fragility, mystery, and deep-seated patriarchal assumptions. And no diagnosis better encapsulates this than the vague, all-encompassing, and terrifyingly common ailment known as hysteria. The term itself comes from the Greek word hystera, meaning womb, and was rooted in the ancient and utterly incorrect belief that a woman's health and emotions were dictated by her uterus. It was thought that the womb could literally wander throughout the body, causing all manner of chaos. By the Victorian era, the theory had evolved, but the diagnosis remained a powerful tool for controlling and explaining female behavior. The symptoms attributed to hysteria were incredibly broad. A woman could be diagnosed for suffering from anxiety, fainting spells, irritability, or insomnia. But she could also be diagnosed for showing signs of intellectual ambition, sexual desire, or a rebellious, unladylike spirit. In essence, any behavior that deviated from the quiet, domestic, and submissive ideal could be labeled as a symptom of a medical disorder originating in her female nature. This catch-all diagnosis was not just a medical opinion, it was a social one. It pathologized female emotion and ambition, turning expressions of frustration or desire into symptoms that needed to be cured. The treatments were as varied and strange as the symptoms. They could range from dietary changes and hydrotherapy to more invasive procedures. And for many women suffering from what we would now recognize as depression, anxiety, or simply the stifling constraints of their society, the diagnosis of hysteria was the first step into a medical world that saw them not as people, but as malfunctioning biological specimens, whose very nature was prone to sickness and disorder. Among the many peculiar treatments prescribed for female hysteria, one of the most famous and psychologically devastating was the rest cure, pioneered by a prominent American neurologist named Silas Weir Mitchell. Doctor, Mitchell believed that the nervous ailments affecting many intelligent and creative women of the upper classes were the result of an overstimulated mind and a depleted physical state. His solution was not to engage the mind, but to utterly extinguish it. He prescribed a regimen of absolute and total rest, a treatment that, in practice, resembled a form of solitary confinement. A woman undergoing the rest cure would be completely removed from her familiar home environment and isolated in a private room or clinic. She was forbidden from leaving her bed. For 6 to 8 weeks, her life was reduced to the 4 walls of her room. She was not allowed to read, to write, to sew, or even to feed herself. A nurse would attend to her every need, bathing her, turning her in bed, and feeding her a high-fat, high-calorie diet, often involving vast quantities of milk, with the goal of increasing her body weight and physical reserves. The core principle was to enforce total physical and intellectual passivity. All decisions were taken away, all stimulus removed. Doctor. Mitchell saw his treatment as a way to re-nourish a depleted nervous system. But for the women who endured it, it was often a form of profound psychological torture. They were intelligent, active individuals suddenly reduced to a state of complete dependency, their minds starved of any engagement. The famous feminist writer Charlotte Perkins Gilman underwent a modified version of the rest cure and was driven to the brink of a complete mental breakdown. She later channeled her horrifying experience into her classic short story, The Yellow Wallpaper, a chilling Gothic tale about a woman who descends into madness while confined to a single room. The story became a powerful indictment of the rest cure, revealing it not as a path to healing, but as a prescription that could crush the spirit and suffocate the mind, all in the name of restoring a woman to her proper, passive domestic role. While doctors were prescribing bizarre cures for the female mind, a far more tangible and relentless force was exerting its pressure on the female body every single day: the corset. More than just an undergarment, the corset was a cultural institution, an essential piece of armor for any respectable Victorian woman. From a young age, girls were laced into corsets to train their bodies into the fashionable silhouette of the era: a tiny, wasp-like waist, a full bust, and wide hips. This idealized shape was not a reflection of natural anatomy, but a rigid, artificial ideal that could only be achieved through constant and often painful compression. The corset of the Victorian era was a formidable piece of engineering. It was typically constructed from stiff fabric, reinforced with numerous strips of whalebone baleen or steel, and tightened at the back with long laces. A woman would be laced in tightly each morning, often by a maid who would place a foot on her back for extra leverage to pull the laces as tight as possible. The goal was to cinch the waist down by several inches, creating a dramatic hourglass figure, while celebrated in fashion plates and society portraits. The physical cost of this ideal was immense and was a subject of considerable medical debate at the time. Doctors frequently wrote about the litany of health problems caused by tight lacing. The constant, crushing pressure displaced internal organs, pushing the liver, stomach, and intestines downwards. It squeezed the ribs, restricting lung capacity and leading to shortness of breath and fainting spells, which were so common they were almost considered a sign of delicate femininity. The corset was also blamed for digestive problems, constipation, and even uterine prolapse. Most insidiously, it caused the muscles of the back and abdomen to atrophy. After years of being artificially supported by the rigid structure of the corset, a woman's own core muscles would become so weak that she might be physically unable to sit or stand upright without it. She became a prisoner of the very device meant to perfect her form. Despite these well-documented medical concerns, The cultural pressure to conform was so immense that most women continued to wear them, enduring the pain and sacrificing their health for the sake of a fashionable and tyrannical ideal of beauty. While the hysterical woman might be confined to her bedroom for the rest cure, for those whose mental distress was more profound, or for those from the lower classes who could not afford such private treatment, a far more terrifying institution awaited the Victorian lunatic asylum. The very word conjures images of Gothic horror, of long, dark corridors, and the haunting sounds of human suffering. And while the reality was complex, it was often not far from this grim imagining. The Victorian era saw massive growth in the construction of these institutions. Driven by a mixture of genuine humanitarian concern and a deep-seated fear of the mentally ill, society sought to house them, to treat them, and above all, to keep them separate from the general population. These asylums were often vast, imposing buildings, set in isolated rural locations, designed to be self-sufficient worlds unto themselves. The early philosophy behind them was one of moral treatment. The idea was that by removing patients from the chaotic environments that supposedly caused their madness and placing them in a structured, orderly setting with fresh air and meaningful work, their sanity could be restored. On paper, it sounded humane. But as the century wore on and these institutions became massively overcrowded and underfunded, the ideal of moral treatment often crumbled into a system of mere containment and control. For many patients, life inside was a monotonous and dehumanizing routine. They were stripped of their personal belongings, their identities reduced to a case number. The treatments they endured ranged from the seemingly benign to the outright brutal. Believing that madness was a physical disease of the brain, doctors experimented with a host of physical cures. Hydrotherapy was common, but it was not the gentle spa treatment we think of today. Patients could be subjected to high-pressure jets of ice-cold water or forcibly submerged in freezing baths for long periods, a shocking treatment meant to jolt the nervous system back into order. Another terrifying device was the centrifugal chair, a spinning contraption in which a patient was strapped and spun at high speed until they lost consciousness, based on the bizarre theory that it would rearrange the contents of the brain into a more rational pattern. For many, the asylum was not a place of healing, but a prison where their illness was met not with compassion, but with a terrifying and deeply misguided medical science. In the bustling marketplace of Victorian ideas, where science, religion, and superstition all vied for attention, few theories captured the public imagination quite like phrenology. It was a pseudoscience that offered a tantalizingly simple premise that the human mind was not a single, mysterious entity, but a collection of distinct mental organs, each with a specific function. And, most importantly, the size and development of these organs could be determined by measuring the bumps and contours of a person's skull. Phrenology was, in essence, a promise to read the very map of someone's character and destiny, simply by feeling their head. The idea was developed in the late 18th century by a German physician named Franz Joseph Gall, but it exploded in popularity during the Victorian era. Phrenologists created elaborate charts and porcelain busts, dividing the head into dozens of small sections, each corresponding to a specific trait. There was a faculty for benevolence, located at the top of the forehead. There was one for amativeness, or the capacity for romantic love, at the base of the skull. There were organs for combativeness, for secretiveness, for self-esteem, and even for the love of home, called inhabitiveness. A prominent bump in a certain area indicated a well-developed faculty, while a depression or hollow suggested a deficiency. This practice became a massive cultural phenomenon. You could visit a professional phrenologist for a personal character reading, much like visiting an astrologer today. They would carefully run their hands over your scalp, taking precise measurements with calipers, before pronouncing you to be naturally witty or dangerously prone to jealousy. Employers might ask for a phrenological assessment before hiring someone, wanting to ensure they had a well-developed organ of conscientiousness. Parents would have their children's heads read to determine their future career paths. It was even used in criminal justice, with phrenologists testifying in court that a defendant's skull showed clear evidence of a deficient moral character. While it was eventually dismissed by mainstream science as baseless quackery, phrenology's appeal is understandable. In a rapidly changing and often confusing world, it offered a simple, tangible, and seemingly scientific way to understand the most complex thing of all human nature itself. While phrenologists were gently probing the exterior of the skull, a far more violent and invasive practice was taking place inside the mouth. For the average Victorian, a visit to the dentist was not the sterile, professional experience it is today. It was an ordeal to be feared and postponed for as long as possible, often until the pain of a rotting tooth became absolutely unbearable. For much of the era, dentistry was not yet a highly specialized medical field. Your local dentist might also be your barber, your blacksmith, or your wig maker, someone with a strong arm and a sturdy set of tools, but little to no medical training. The primary solution for a diseased tooth was simple and brutal extraction, and the most iconic instrument of this era of dental horror was the tooth key. This was a fearsome-looking metal tool, resembling a large, old-fashioned door key. It had a handle at one end, and at the other, a claw that was designed to hook over the top of the offending tooth. The crosspiece, or bolster, would be placed against the root of the tooth on the gum line. Once the claw was secured, the operator would grip the handle and make a sharp, forceful turn, much like turning a key in a lock. The immense leverage would, hopefully, break the tooth free from the ligaments and bone holding it in the jaw. The procedure was, of course, performed without anesthetic and was excruciatingly painful. More often than not, it resulted in complications. The sheer force of the instrument could fracture the patient's jaw or break the crown of the tooth, leaving the jagged, infected roots still embedded in the gum. It could also shatter neighboring teeth or cause severe damage to the surrounding tissue. In the hands of an unskilled operator, it was a tool of sheer butchery. It's no wonder that people dreaded the process, often enduring years of chronic pain before submitting to the terrifying prospect of having their tooth turned by the blacksmith's key. The tooth key stands as a powerful symbol of Victorian dentistry, a crude, mechanical solution to a biological problem, applied with brute force in the absence of finesse or true medical understanding. In an age defined by its rigid social codes and public displays of mourning, no practice strikes the modern eye as more intimate, unsettling, and profoundly sad than postmortem photography. For us today, photography is about capturing the vibrancy of life. For the Victorians, it also became a vital way to capture the stillness of death. The practice arose from a confluence of two very different realities: the new, miraculous invention of the daguerreotype, which made photographic portraits accessible for the first time, and the tragically high mortality rates, especially among infants and children. For many families, a child's death might be the first and only opportunity to have a permanent likeness of them created. The post-mortem photograph was not seen as morbid or ghoulish. It was a cherished, and often the only, memento of a lost loved one. These were not candid snapshots of death, but carefully, and lovingly. Staged portraits. The deceased, most often a child, would be dressed in their finest clothes and posed as if in a peaceful sleep. They might be arranged in a crib, on a sofa, or sometimes, poignantly, held in the arms of their grieving mother or surrounded by their surviving siblings. The goal was to create an image, not of death, but of peaceful repose. A final, serene memory frozen in time. Photographers developed subtle techniques to create this illusion of life. A stand might be used to prop the body upright, and sometimes the photographer would later delicately paint open eyes onto the closed lids of the printed photograph. Looking at these images today is a profoundly moving experience. They are a window into the heart of Victorian grief, a world where death was a constant, familiar presence in the home. The desire to have one last image, one tangible thing to hold on to when a life had been cut so tragically short, transcended any sense of the macabre. It was an act of remembrance, an attempt to cheat death of its finality, a testament to love and loss in an age of ever-present sorrow. The Victorian era was a time of profound fascination with new and mysterious forces. Spiritualism promised contact with the dead. Mesmerism suggested the power of animal magnetism. And the most tangible and exciting of these new forces was electricity. It was a clean, silent, and seemingly magical power that was beginning to light up cities and drive new inventions. It was only natural, in an age so desperate for new cures, that this electrifying force would be harnessed in the service of medicine. If electricity could power a motor or send a message down a telegraph wire, surely it could re-energize a sickly human body. This led to the rise of electrotherapy, a new and exciting branch of medicine that promised to treat a staggering array of ailments with a mild therapeutic shock. Legitimate physicians and opportunistic quacks alike embraced the technology. Large, intimidating electrostatic generators were installed in hospitals and private clinics. A patient suffering from paralysis or a nervous disorder would be seated on an insulated chair and subjected to controlled sparks and shocks, with the doctor hoping to jolt the sluggish nerves back into action. The tingling sensation and twitching muscles were seen as clear evidence that the treatment was working, that the body's own vital energy was being restored. But the craze was not confined to the doctor's office. A huge market emerged for domestic electrotherapy devices, allowing people to treat themselves in the comfort of their own homes. There were electric corsets that promised to invigorate the organs, electric hairbrushes that claimed to cure baldness by stimulating the scalp, and electric belts that a gentleman could wear to supposedly increase his masculine vigor. One of the most popular devices was the electromagnetic machine, a small, hand-cranked generator in a wooden box. A family could gather in the parlor, each holding on to a metal handle, and pass a gentle, buzzing current through their bodies, believing they were all partaking in a scientifically advanced form of health maintenance. While largely harmless, electrotherapy was a perfect storm of Victorian enthusiasm, a blend of genuine scientific curiosity, clever marketing, and a profound, almost mystical belief that the power of the machine could and should be used to perfect the frailties of the human body. While the Victorians were embracing new technologies like electrotherapy with almost religious fervor, their medicine cabinets also contained remedies that were shockingly ancient. This was an era of strange coexistences. A doctor who prescribed a dose of a new chemical compound might also, without any sense of contradiction, recommend a treatment that would have been familiar to a physician in medieval or even ancient times. One of the most bizarre and enduring of these ancient remedies was the use of mumia, or mummy powder. For centuries, It was believed that the preserved bodies of ancient Egyptians held potent medicinal properties. The practice was rooted in a historical misunderstanding. The word mummy comes from the Persian word mumia, which referred to bitumen, a natural asphalt that was believed to have healing powers. Early sources suggested that the Egyptians used this substance in their embalming process. Therefore, it was reasoned the preserved bodies themselves must be saturated with these healing properties. By the Victorian era, a gruesome but lucrative trade had existed for centuries, where Egyptian tombs were plundered, and the preserved bodies of pharaohs, priests, and commoners alike were ground into a fine, dark powder. This mummy powder was then sold by apothecaries and prescribed by doctors as a treatment for an astonishing range of ailments. It was thought to cure everything from headaches and bruising to epilepsy and internal bleeding. It could be mixed with wine or water and consumed as a tonic, or blended with fat or honey to create a topical ointment to be spread on wounds. While some doctors were beginning to question its efficacy, the belief in its power was deeply ingrained in popular medicine. The irony is profound. In an age that prided itself on its scientific progress and Christian morality, respectable people were, in essence, practicing a form of medicinal cannibalism, consuming the ground-up remains of a long-dead civilization in a desperate and utterly misguided search for a cure. Alongside the rise of patent medicines and the persistence of ancient remedies, the Victorians also developed a passion for what they called the water cure, or hydropathy. It became a fashionable and widespread movement, with large, impressive hydropathic establishments, essentially medical spas, being built across the country and in America. The central belief of hydropathy was that water, when applied in a rigorous and systematic way, could cure a vast range of chronic illnesses. The theory was that a regimen of cold water treatments would shock the nervous system, stimulate circulation, and induce a crisis, often in the form of boils or a rash, which was seen as the body's way of expelling the disease from its system. A patient arriving at one of these establishments would be subjected to a strict and often grueling daily routine. The day might begin before dawn, with an attendant coming into the room and wrapping the patient tightly in cold, wet linen sheets, a process known as the wet pack. The patient would be left to lie in this chilly, damp cocoon for an hour or more, with the goal of raising their body temperature and inducing a profuse sweat. This would be followed by a plunge into a bath of cold water to shock the system. Throughout the day, other treatments would be administered. There were douches, which involved being sprayed with high-pressure jets of cold water, and sitz baths, where the patient would sit in a tub of cold water. Alongside these external treatments, patients were expected to drink enormous quantities of fresh spring water, sometimes up to a dozen glasses a day, to help flush the impurities from their system. While for some, the clean living, simple diet, and fresh air of these establishments may have brought some health benefits. For many others, the constant exposure to cold and damp was a miserable and debilitating ordeal. It was a cure that sought to purify the body through shock and endurance, a testament to the Victorian belief in discipline and fortitude as a path to health. In this chaotic landscape of competing medical theories, where established doctors offered poisons and cold baths as cures, a space opened up for a new kind of practitioner, the quack doctor, the traveling salesman, the charismatic showman with a miracle cure in a bottle. In an age with virtually no government regulation over medicine, anyone with enough confidence in a good story could sell their own concoctions, and the public, desperate for relief from chronic pain and incurable diseases, was an eager and often gullible market. These were the purveyors of snake oil and other patent medicines, who would travel from town to town, often setting up a small stage at a local fair or market. Their sales pitch was a form of theater. They were brilliant storytellers, weaving tales of secret formulas learned from exotic travels, ancient Egyptian manuscripts, or Native American tribes. They would speak with scientific-sounding jargon, name-dropping chemicals, and inventing impressive-sounding medical conditions, all designed to dazzle and confuse their audience. They often employed a shill, someone planted in the crowd who would testify to the miraculous effects of the cure, claiming to have been healed from a terrible affliction. The products themselves were a mystery. The bottles were often beautifully designed, with elaborate labels and promising names like Dr. Kilmer's Swamp Root, Peruna, or Hamlin's Wizard Oil. They promised to cure everything: kidney disease, consumption, baldness, cancer, and general weakness. The secret ingredients, of course, were far from magical. Most of these tonics were little more than a mixture of cheap alcohol, water, and some harmless or not so harmless herbs or flavorings. They didn't cure anything, but the high alcohol content would often make the patient feel temporarily better, a warm, pleasant buzz that could be mistaken for returning health. The quack doctor was a master of psychology, selling not a medicine, but hope itself, bottled, branded, and sold for a shilling to the desperate and the dying. For much of history, the hospital was not the place of healing and recovery that we think of today. It was, for many, the last stop before the grave. These institutions, often run by religious orders, were primarily charitable almshouses, places that cared for the destitute, the orphaned, and the terminally ill. The wealthy and even the middle class were almost always treated in their own homes by private physicians. To be sent to a hospital was a sign of extreme poverty, an admission that you had no family and no resources to care for you. They were often seen as gateways to death, not gateways to health, and the public perception was one of dread. However, the Victorian era witnessed a profound transformation in the role and reputation of the hospital. This change was driven by several factors. The massive growth of cities created a huge population of urban poor who had no other option for care. At the same time, the rise of medical science and the new importance of surgery created a need for centralized locations where doctors could practice, teach, and conduct research. The hospital became the new laboratory for medical advancement. Philanthropy also played a crucial role. Wealthy industrialists and aristocrats, driven by a sense of civic duty and Christian charity, began to fund the construction of large, new public hospitals. These were often grand, imposing buildings designed to be beacons of scientific progress and social compassion, while conditions inside were still often grim, and the risk of infection remained terrifyingly high for much of the century. The fundamental idea of the hospital began to shift. It was slowly transforming from a place where the poor went to die into a place where anyone, regardless of class, could receive the most advanced medical treatment available. It was the birth of the modern hospital, an institution that would become the very center of the healthcare world. As hospitals grew in prominence, another quiet revolution was taking place within their walls, a revolution led by one of the most iconic figures of the Victorian era, Florence Nightingale. Before Nightingale, nursing was not the respected, trained profession it is today. It was generally seen as a low-status, undesirable job, often undertaken by poor, uneducated women with few other options. Nurses were often stereotyped as being slovenly, drunk, and indifferent to the suffering of their patients. The hospital ward was a place of chaos, and the nurse was simply another part of its grim furniture. The Crimean War of the 1850s changed everything. Reports streamed back to Britain describing the horrifying conditions in the military hospitals where wounded soldiers were dying in droves, not from their battle wounds, but from diseases like cholera and typhus that ran rampant in the filthy, overcrowded wards. In response, Florence Nightingale, a well-educated woman from a wealthy family, led a small team of volunteer nurses to the British hospital in Scutari. What she found there was a scene from hell. The hospital was infested with vermin, the sewers were overflowing, and the men were lying on soiled straw pallets without clean water, fresh bandages, or decent food. Nightingale did not just offer comfort. She brought order and discipline. She understood, long before germ theory was accepted, that there was a fundamental link between sanitation and health. She and her team scrubbed the hospital from top to bottom, secured clean bedding and supplies, and established a functioning kitchen to provide nutritious food. She was a tireless administrator and a fierce advocate for her patients, famously making her rounds late at night with a lamp, earning her the enduring nickname, the Lady with the Lamp. Her efforts dramatically reduced the death rate in the hospital. When she returned to Britain, she was a national hero. She used her newfound fame to establish the first professional nursing school in the world at St. Thomas's Hospital in London, transforming nursing from a menial job into a respectable, highly skilled profession for women. She elevated the nurse to an essential, compassionate, and scientifically minded partner in the art of healing. While Florence Nightingale was revolutionizing hospital hygiene through practical observation and tireless administration, a French chemist named Louis Pasteur was waging a very different kind of war on the microscopic front. For centuries, one of the most fundamental questions in biology was a mystery: where did life come from? The prevailing theory was spontaneous generation, the belief that living organisms could arise directly from non-living matter. It was thought that maggots could spontaneously appear from rotting meat, or that microorganisms could simply materialize in a cloudy broth. It was in his efforts to disprove this ancient idea that Pasteur would stumble upon a truth that would change medicine forever. Through a series of elegant and now famous experiments in the early 1860s, Pasteur proved that this was not the case. In his most well-known experiment, he used a special swan neck flask. He boiled a broth inside the flask to kill any existing microorganisms. But the S-shaped neck allowed air to enter while trapping airborne dust and microbes in its lower bend. The sterile broth remained clear indefinitely. However, when Pasteur tilted the flask, allowing the broth to come into contact with the trapped dust, it quickly became cloudy with microbial life. He had proven, conclusively, that the microorganisms did not appear from nowhere. They were carried on dust particles in the air. This was the birth of the germ theory of disease. Pasteur's work demonstrated that fermentation, decay, and by extension, many diseases were not caused by bad air or spontaneous chemical processes, but by the action of living, invisible germs. The implications were staggering. It meant that disease had a specific, physical cause. It meant that this cause could be studied, understood, and, most importantly, fought. Pasteur's discoveries laid the scientific foundation for Joseph Lister's work on antiseptics and would eventually lead to the development of vaccines and antibiotics. The invisible world of the microbe had been revealed, and medicine was about to enter a new and truly scientific age. The phantom enemy finally had a name. If Louis Pasteur had revealed the existence of the microscopic world of germs, it was a German physician named Robert Koch who gave doctors the map and the tools to navigate it. Koch, a meticulous and brilliant country doctor, took Pasteur's general theory and refined it into a precise science. He wasn't content just to know that germs cause disease. He wanted to know exactly which germ caused which disease. His work in the 1870s and 1880s would transform the practice of medicine, turning it from a world of vague theories into a science of specific causes and effects. Koch's genius lay in his laboratory methods. He developed revolutionary techniques for growing bacteria in a pure culture, using a solid medium made from agar, a type of seaweed. This allowed him to isolate a single type of bacterium from a sample and grow it into a visible colony, uncontaminated by other microbes. For the first time, scientists could study a single species of bacteria in detail. He also perfected techniques for staining bacteria with chemical dyes, making them clearly visible under a microscope. The invisible world was not only revealed, it was being cataloged. Using these methods, Koch embarked on a legendary hunt for the specific microbes responsible for humanity's deadliest diseases. In 1876, he proved conclusively that a specific bacterium, Bacillus anthracis, was the cause of anthrax. A few years later, in 1882, he delivered one of the most stunning announcements in medical history. He had isolated the bacterium that caused tuberculosis, the white plague that was devastating Europe. The following year, he identified the bacillus that caused cholera. To provide a rigorous framework for his work, he developed what became known as Koch's postulates, a set of 4 criteria that must be met to prove that a specific microbe causes a specific disease. His work provided the undeniable proof that doctors needed. The enemy was no longer a miasma or an imbalance of humors. It was a specific, identifiable invader that could be hunted, studied, and, one day, defeated. The identification of specific germs was a monumental step, but it led to an even more important question once you found the enemy. How do you defeat it? The answer came not from a new invention, but from the scientific refinement of an old idea. The concept of vaccination had been pioneered at the very end of the 18th century by an English doctor named Edward Jenner, who noticed that milkmaids who contracted the mild disease cowpox seemed to be immune to the ravages of smallpox. His brilliant insight that exposure to a weaker form of a disease could provide protection against the deadlier version had saved countless lives. But no one understood why it worked. It was Louis Pasteur, the father of germ theory, who would provide the answer. He theorized that if a disease was caused by a microbe, then a weakened or attenuated version of that same microbe could be introduced into the body to train it to fight off a future infection. He applied this principle to diseases like chicken cholera and anthrax in animals, developing the first laboratory-created vaccines and proving his theory correct. But his most famous and most dramatic human trial came in 885 with a disease that was, until then, a certain and terrifying death sentence: rabies. A 9-year-old boy named Joseph Meister had been severely bitten by a rabid dog. His desperate mother brought him to Pasteur in Paris, begging the scientist to try his new experimental rabies vaccine. Pasteur was not a medical doctor and was hesitant to treat a human. But he knew the boy would otherwise die a horrible death. He took the gamble. Over the course of several days, Pasteur administered a series of progressively stronger injections of the attenuated rabies virus, harvested from the spinal cords of infected rabbits. The world watched, holding its breath. Miraculously, the boy survived. He never developed rabies. The news was an international sensation. Pasteur had not only cured the incurable, but he had demonstrated the immense power of the new science of immunology. The age of vaccination had truly begun, offering humanity its first real offensive weapon in the long war against infectious disease. As the Victorian era drew to its close, one more discovery would arrive that seemed to belong more to the realm of magic than science. For all of human history, the inner workings of the body had been a complete mystery, visible only to the surgeon's knife or the anatomist's scalpel after death. Then, in 1895, a German physicist named Wilhelm Röntgen, while experimenting with cathode rays in his laboratory, noticed a strange, faint glow coming from a nearby screen coated with a fluorescent chemical. He realized he had stumbled upon a new, unknown kind of ray, one that was invisible to the eye but could pass through solid objects like paper, wood, and even human flesh. He called them X-rays, with X signifying the unknown. The first X-ray image he took was of his wife's hand. The photograph revealed the ghostly, delicate structure of her bones, with her wedding ring appearing as a dark, solid band. The image was astonishing, eerie, and utterly revolutionary. When Röntgen published his findings, the news created an immediate global sensation. For medicine, the implications were profound. For the first time, doctors could look inside a living human body without making a single incision. They could see broken bones with perfect clarity, locate a swallowed coin in a child's throat, or find a bullet lodged deep within a soldier's body. The X-ray machine quickly became an essential diagnostic tool. Public demonstrations were held, where people could have their hands X-rayed, marveling at the strange, skeletal images of themselves. There was an almost mystical quality to it, the ability to see the unseen, to peer through the veil of flesh and blood. Of course, in these early days, the dangers of radiation were completely unknown. Patients and operators alike were exposed to massive doses, and it would be years before the terrible consequences, like burns and cancers, were understood. But in that first flush of discovery, the X-ray was seen as a pure miracle, a medical superpower that promised to eliminate the guesswork and finally illuminate the dark, hidden interior of the human body. And so, as the 19th century came to a close, the world of medicine was almost unrecognizable from what it had been just a few generations earlier. The bizarre landscape of bloodletting, poisonous cures, and miasma theory was slowly, but surely, giving way to a new world based on scientific evidence. The journey had been strange, and often brutal, but the foundations of modern medicine had been laid. The operating theater, once a chamber of screaming horror, had been silenced by anesthesia. The invisible terror of infection, which had claimed more lives than the surgeon's knife, was now being fought with Lister's antiseptics. The true enemies, the specific bacteria responsible for diseases like tuberculosis and cholera, had been identified and dragged into the light by the meticulous work of Koch and Pasteur. For the first time, humanity had an offensive weapon against plagues that had tormented it for millennia, in the form of vaccines. And with the ghostly images produced by Röntgen's X-rays, doctors were no longer working in the dark. They could see inside the fortress of the human body without laying it open with a blade. Of course, the bizarre did not vanish overnight. Quack remedies were still sold. Old superstitions died hard. And many of the new discoveries would take decades to become standard practice. But the tide had turned. The fundamental principles had been established. The belief in bad air, wandering wombs, and character-defining bumps on the head was being replaced by a rigorous new creed, the scientific method. The slow, painful, and often bizarre dawn of modern medicine had finally arrived, built upon the hard-won lessons of a century of brilliant insight and profound, often fatal, error. To understand why a crowd would cheer at the sight of a man hanging from a rope, we first have to walk in their shoes on the muddy, unpaved roads of medieval Europe. Life, for the vast majority, was not a grand adventure of knights and ladies. It was short, often brutal, and relentlessly difficult. The average person lived in a world without sanitation, without modern medicine, where a simple infection could be a death sentence. Famine was a recurring ghost. A bad harvest could wipe out a village, and disease, like the great shadow of the Black Death, could steal away a third of the continent in a few short years. Death was not a stranger they met once in old age. It was a constant neighbor. They saw it in the faces of their children who didn't survive infancy. They saw it in the town square when the plague cart rolled by. They saw it on the roads where bandits could strike without warning. This constant, intimate familiarity with death created a different kind of psyche than our own. It fostered a resilience, yes, but also a certain hardness, a desensitization of suffering that we might find shocking. In a world so saturated with random, chaotic death, a death that was controlled, that had a reason and a ritual, could feel strangely reassuring. It was a way of imposing order on the ultimate chaos. Before we judge the crowd, we must first feel the cold of their world, a world where the line between life and death was perilously thin. In this world of uncertainty, two pillars stood with absolute authority: the church and the monarchy. They were the twin suns around which medieval life orbited. The king, or the local lord, held power over your body and your property. He was the law. His word could raise you up or strike you down. Justice was not an abstract concept debated by philosophers. It was a direct expression of the ruler's power. To defy the king's law was to defy the king himself, and such a challenge could not go unanswered. It required a public display, a demonstration of what happens when the established order is threatened. Beside the king stood the church, holding dominion over something even more precious, your immortal soul. The church taught that the pains of this life were temporary, but the judgment of the next was eternal. To commit a crime was not just to break the king's peace, but to commit a sin against God. This meant that punishment had a dual purpose. It was a worldly consequence for a crime, but it was also a spiritual drama. The scaffold became a stage where the soul of the condemned was fought over. A public confession could save your soul from eternal damnation, even as it condemned your body to a horrific end. From these twin peaks of power, a form of justice was born. It was not meant to be hidden away in quiet courtrooms. It was meant to be seen, to be heard, and to be feared by all. Let's now step onto that stage and examine the performance of punishment. So, picture the scene. Forget the manicured, tourist-friendly squares you might see in Europe today, with their cafes and souvenir shops. We need to transport ourselves to the real thing. The medieval town square was the pulsating, chaotic, and often filthy heart of the community. It was the internet, the television, and the shopping mall all rolled into one. The ground would be a mess of trodden earth, mud, and animal droppings, crisscrossed by the tracks of wooden carts. The air would be thick with a symphony of smells, the scent of baking bread from a nearby oven, the stench of the butcher's stall, the sweat of the crowd, and the sharp metallic tang of spilled blood from a previous market day, or perhaps a previous execution. This was not a place of quiet reflection. It was a place of noise and life. Merchants would shout their prices. Beggars would plead for alms, children would chase stray dogs, and town criers would bellow out the latest news and decrees from the Lord. And it was right here, in the middle of all this messy, vibrant, everyday life, that the scaffold would be erected. It wasn't hidden away. It was placed center stage, impossible to ignore. This was deliberate. Justice was not a private affair. It was a community event, a lesson for all to see. The very architecture of the square, often with the church on one side and the Guildhall on the other, framed the execution as a central pillar of civic and religious life. It was a stark reminder, woven into the very fabric of their daily existence, that the king's law and God's judgment were absolute, and the consequences for defiance were brutally, unavoidably public. Now, let's talk about the crowd, because the crowd is the key to understanding this whole phenomenon. An execution day was often a public holiday. People would travel from surrounding villages, sometimes for days, to witness the event. For many, especially those living in rural isolation, it was a rare and exciting opportunity to come to town, to see and be seen. The atmosphere wasn't always one of solemn dread. More often than not, it felt like a festival or a major sporting event. Imagine vendors setting up their stalls around the edges of the square, selling meat pies, ale, and cheap souvenirs. Balladmongers would hawk crudely printed sheets with songs and poems about the condemned person's crimes, often filled with lurid and exaggerated details. Parents would hoist their children onto their shoulders to give them a better view, believing they were teaching them a valuable lesson about crime and punishment. People would greet their neighbors, gossip, and place bets on how the condemned would behave. Would he cry? Would he confess? Would he die bravely? The execution itself was the main event, the climax of a day of social gathering. This festive, almost carnival-like atmosphere seems shocking to us, but it speaks to how deeply ingrained this form of justice was in the culture. It wasn't an interruption of normal life. It was a scheduled, anticipated, and for many, an enjoyable part of it. The public execution was a spectacle, a piece of civic theater where the entire community had a role to play. So, the central question remains, why would thousands of people gather? Not just to watch, but seemingly to enjoy such a gruesome spectacle. The answer isn't simple. It's a complex tapestry woven from threads of human psychology, social pressure, and the raw realities of medieval life. Firstly, there was the element of raw, morbid curiosity. In a world with limited entertainment, an execution was a real-life drama of the highest stakes. It was a confrontation with the ultimate taboo death in a controlled and public setting. It allowed people to peer into the abyss from a safe distance, to feel the thrill of fear without being in actual danger. Then, there was the powerful concept of catharsis, a collective emotional release. The crowd wasn't just a group of individuals. It was a single entity, pulsating with shared emotion. The crimes of the condemned often represented a threat to the community's stability, a theft, a murder, an act of rebellion. The execution, then, became a ritual to purge the community of that threat. The jeers, the insults, the cheers at the final moment were a way for the people to collectively express their anger, their fear, and their relief. It reaffirmed their own righteousness. By condemning the outcast, they reinforced their own place within the group, their own adherence to the social and moral code. I am not him, was the unspoken thought. I am one of the good people. It was a powerful, bonding experience that strengthened the ties of the community by defining who was outside of it. We have to understand that these events were deliberately staged, much like a play. They were, in essence, live-action morality plays designed to teach a lesson to the illiterate masses. Every participant had a role. You had the condemned, the central figure, whose fate was the subject of the drama. You had the priest, representing God's mercy and judgment, urging a final confession. You had the executioner, the embodiment of the state's power, the instrument of justice. And you had the crowd, the chorus, representing society itself, there to witness, to judge, and to learn. The narrative was almost always the same. A crime had been committed, disrupting the natural order of things. The criminal was captured, tried, and sentenced. The execution was the final act, the climax where order was restored, the ideal performance. From the authorities' point of view, involved a condemned person who played their part perfectly. They would give a heartfelt speech from the scaffold, confessing their sins, acknowledging the justice of their sentence, and warning others not to follow their example. This confession was crucial. It wasn't just about admitting guilt. It was about validating the entire system of power. It was the sinner submitting to the authority of both the king and God. When the axe fell, or the trap door opened, it was not just the end of a life. It was the triumphant conclusion of a story, a brutal but clear message that order had been restored. And the world was once again as it should be. The spectacle served to reinforce the idea that justice, while terrifying, was a fundamental part of the divine and social fabric. In this grim theater, no actor was more crucial or more feared than the executioner. We often think of the executioner as a simple brute, a thug in a black hood. But the reality was far more complex. He was, in fact, a highly skilled, state-sanctioned professional. Being an executioner wasn't just about swinging an axe. It required a precise knowledge of human anatomy. It required the strength to wield heavy tools and the steady hand to make a clean cut. A botched execution, which we will discuss later, was a disaster for everyone involved. It turned the crowd hostile, undermined the authority of the state, and prolonged the agony of the condemned. A good executioner was one who could perform his duty efficiently and with a grim sort of professionalism. Despite this necessary skill, the executioner occupied a bizarre and lonely place in society. He was an essential part of the justice system, yet he was also an outcast. His trade was considered unclean. People feared him and shunned him. He often had to live outside the city walls, and his family was stigmatized for generations. In some places, they were forced to wear identifying clothing. He was the man who touched death, and that taint clung to him. This social isolation was a strange paradox. He was the ultimate insider, the final instrument of the law, but he was forced to live as the ultimate outsider. He was a walking, breathing embodiment of the state's power to kill, a necessary monster that society created, and then shunned for the very work it demanded of him. Of all the methods of execution, hanging was perhaps the most common, the workhorse of the medieval justice system. It was cheap, efficient, and highly visible. But the hanging of the medieval period was not the clinical, instantaneous procedure we might imagine today. This was the era of the short drop, where the condemned was simply pushed from a ladder or a cart, with the rope tied to a tree branch or a permanent gallows. The fall was not long enough to break the neck. Instead, death came slowly, gruesomely, by strangulation. The victim would twitch and struggle at the end of the rope, a grotesque and horrifying dance that could last for several minutes. This struggle was often referred to grimly as the dance of death, or dancing on air. It was this slow, agonizing process that was the true spectacle for the crowd. They would watch intently, some in horrified silence, others with jeers and morbid fascination. Sometimes, friends or family members of the condemned, taking pity, would run forward and pull on the victim's legs to hasten their end. A small, desperate act of mercy in the midst of a state-sanctioned ritual of cruelty. The image of a body swinging from the gallows became the ultimate symbol of justice. Permanent gallows were often built at the crossroads just outside a town, a constant, silent warning to any traveler or local who passed by. It was a clear and ever-present message. This is what happens to those who break the law here. The dance of death was a performance that lingered in the mind long after the body was cut down. While the common thief or murderer met their end at the end of a rope, the nobility were often granted a different, and, in the medieval mindset, a more honorable death beheading. To die by the sword or the axe was considered a warrior's death, a swift and noble end that avoided the slow, degrading spectacle of strangulation. It was a privilege of rank, a final acknowledgement of one's station in life, even in the face of ultimate disgrace. The condemned noble would be allowed to make a final speech, to pray, and to meet their end kneeling, a posture of submission, but also of dignity. However, this merciful death was entirely dependent on the skill of the executioner. A single, clean strike was the ideal, but it was not always the reality. An inexperienced or nervous executioner, a blunt blade, or a slight movement from the condemned could turn the scene into a gruesome butchery. There are numerous historical accounts of beheadings that required multiple hacking blows to sever the head from the body. The tragic execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, though happening just after the medieval period, is a famous example of this kind of horror. The first blow of the axe missed her neck and struck the back of her head. It took a second and even a third strike to complete the ghastly task. For the crowd, such a botched execution transformed a moment of solemn justice into a horrifying spectacle of incompetence and prolonged suffering, a reminder that even the privileges of the nobility could not always spare them from a terrible end. There were crimes, however, that were considered so heinous, so fundamentally offensive to God and the natural order, that a simple hanging or beheading was deemed insufficient. For the heretic, the witch, or the blasphemer, a more symbolic and agonizing punishment was reserved: burning at the stake. This was not just about ending a life. It was about total annihilation. It was about using the purifying power of fire to cleanse the community of a spiritual stain and to offer a terrifying preview of the fires of hell that awaited the sinner. The process was one of slow, escalating horror. The condemned would be tied to a post, often in the center of the square, with bundles of wood and straw piled high around their feet. The crowd would watch as the flames were lit, first licking at the wood, then catching hold, slowly engulfing the victim in smoke and fire. Death was agonizingly slow, coming from a combination of severe burns, heat stroke, and the inhalation of hot gases and smoke. For the authorities, particularly the Church during the Inquisition, this method served a powerful theological purpose. Fire was seen as a cleansing agent, the only thing that could truly destroy the evil of heresy and witchcraft, leaving no physical trace of the sinner behind. For the crowd, it was the most dreadful and awe-inspiring of all spectacles, a visceral representation of divine wrath made manifest on earth. The story of Joan of Arc, though a complex political case, remains the most enduring image of this terrible fate, a symbol of faith and defiance in the face of the ultimate purifying punishment. The punishment did not always end with death. For the most notorious criminals, pirates, rebels, traitors, the state sought to make an example that would last for weeks, months, or even years. This led to the practice of gibbeting, or displaying the dead body in a public place. After an execution, the body of the condemned would be placed in a metal cage, custom fitted to the human form, and hung from a prominent location. This might be at a city gate, a major crossroads, or overlooking a harbor, ensuring the maximum number of people would see it. The purpose was simple: to serve as a constant, gruesome warning. Imagine traveling to a new town and the first thing you see is a body, or what's left of it, rotting in an iron cage, picked at by crows and exposed to the elements. The message was unmistakable. This was a place where justice was harsh and unforgiving. The body would remain there until it had completely decomposed, the bones eventually scattering on the ground below. It was a form of psychological warfare against lawlessness, turning the criminal's own body into a permanent monument of their disgrace. In some parts of the world, like the lands terrorized by Vlad the Impaler in Wallachia, this concept was taken even further. There, impalement was the preferred method, a horrifying execution where the victim was pierced with a large wooden stake, which was then raised upright, leaving them to die a slow, agonizing death. The force of the impaled that Vlad created were a terrifying testament to the power of using the dead as a relentless warning to the living. If there was one punishment that seemed engineered by nightmares, it was the breaking wheel. This was not a swift death. It was a slow, methodical, and unimaginably painful deconstruction of the human body, reserved for criminals who had committed the most heinous of acts. The condemned was taken to a public scaffold and firmly tied, spread-eagled, to a large wooden cartwheel. The executioner, armed with a heavy iron bar or hammer, would then begin his terrible work. The goal was not to kill, not yet. The goal was to break. Methodically, the executioner would strike the victim's limbs, shattering the bones in their arms and legs with sickening, crunching blows. The joints were often avoided to ensure the victim remained conscious and could feel every moment of the ordeal. Once the limbs were a mangled ruin of splintered bone and torn flesh, the executioner would weave the broken, now pliable body through the spokes of the wheel. The wheel was then hoisted onto a tall pole, leaving the shattered victim on display for the horrified crowd, groaning in agony. Death would come hours, or sometimes even days, later from shock, dehydration, or blood loss. In some cases, a blow of mercy to the chest or head would be granted, but often the victim was simply left to the elements and the circling crows. The breaking wheel was the ultimate expression of the state's power to not just take a life, but to utterly destroy a body in the slowest and most public way imaginable. For the crime of high treason, the ultimate offense against the king and the entire kingdom, an equally ultimate punishment was devised. In England, this became the infamous sentence of being hanged, drawn, and quartered. It was a punishment so complex and so brutal that its very description sounds like something from a deranged fantasy. But it was horrifyingly real. This fate was reserved almost exclusively for men. Women convicted of treason were typically burned at the stake, a small yet significant distinction in a world of prescribed cruelty. The process was a multi-stage ordeal, each part designed to inflict maximum pain and humiliation. First, the condemned was drawn, meaning they were tied to a wooden hurdle, like a sled, and dragged by a horse through the public streets to the place of execution. Second, they were hanged by the neck, but for only a short time, and cut down while still conscious. It was at this point that the true horror began. The victim, still alive and able to see what was happening, was then disemboweled. Their intestines and organs would be pulled out and burned on a fire before their very eyes. Finally, the now dead body was beheaded, and the torso was quartered, or chopped into 4 pieces. The ordeal was complete, but the message was not. The preserved head was often displayed on a spike on London Bridge, while the 4 quarters of the body were sent to different cities across the kingdom. A grisly and widespread warning against any thought of rebellion. The execution of William Wallace, the Scottish hero, is a famous and brutal example of this sentence being carried out to its full, terrifying extent. The speech from the scaffold was a critical and often highly anticipated part of the execution drama. This was the moment when the central figure, the condemned, finally had the stage all to themselves. Their last words, delivered to the massive crowd, could take many forms and serve different purposes. For the authorities, the ideal speech was one of confession and repentance. A prisoner who admitted their guilt, praised the king's justice, and warned others against a life of crime was the perfect final act. It reinforced the legitimacy of the system and provided a clear moral lesson for the spectators. Priests and officials would often spend the prisoners' final days coaching them, urging them to make a good death by confessing and saving their soul. However, not all prisoners played their part so obediently. The scaffold also offered a final, desperate platform for defiance. Some used their last moments to proclaim their innocence, to condemn the corruption of their accusers, or to make a political statement. These were dangerous moments for the authorities. A charismatic and defiant prisoner could win the sympathy of the crowd, turning them from passive observers into a potentially riotous mob. In other cases, the condemned might use their speech for simple, gallows humor, telling jokes or making sarcastic remarks to show their contempt for death. And some, of course, met their end in stoic silence or with quiet prayer. For the crowd, these final words were mesmerizing. They were a raw, unfiltered glimpse into the heart of a person facing eternity. And whether they were repentant, defiant, or resigned, their speech was the last, vital piece of the public ritual of death. It's impossible to separate the spectacle of a medieval execution from the immense power of the church. The event was as much a religious ritual as it was a legal one. A priest was almost always present on the scaffold, acting as the spiritual guide in the final moments. His role was twofold. On one hand, he was there to offer the possibility of salvation. By hearing a final confession and administering the last rites, the priest could offer the condemned a chance at redemption in the next life, even as their body was destroyed in this one. This was a powerful message to the crowd. No matter how grave the sin, God's mercy was still attainable through the church. On the other hand, the priest's presence served to legitimize the execution itself. It framed the state's action as being in harmony with divine will. The execution became a way of purging the community of sin, a necessary act to maintain spiritual as well as social order. The procession to the gallows often resembled a religious parade, sometimes beginning with a mass. The condemned was urged to repent publicly, and his final prayers were led by the priest. This deep intertwining of state justice and religious ceremony turned the execution into a profound spiritual drama. For the crowd, they were not just watching a man die. They were witnessing a soul's final battle between damnation and salvation. a visceral reminder of their own mortality and the ever-present need for piety and obedience to both God and King. While the most gruesome punishments were often reserved for men, women were by no means exempt from the brutalities of the public square. However, the types of crimes and the corresponding punishments often reflected the deeply patriarchal nature of medieval society. Women were not typically executed for crimes like rebellion or treason in the same way men were. Their alleged offenses were more often rooted in morality, social order, and superstition. The crime of witchcraft became almost exclusively female over time, leading to the horrific burnings at the stake we've already discussed. For crimes like adultery or scolding, that is, being a publicly quarrelsome or nagging woman, the punishments were more focused on public humiliation than outright execution. The cucking stool, or ducking stool, was a common device. A chair attached to a long wooden arm. The convicted woman would be strapped into the chair and then repeatedly dunked into a river or pond, to the jeers and amusement of the crowd. Another humiliating punishment was the scold's bridle, or brank, an iron muzzle with a built-in gag or plate that was forced into the mouth to prevent speech. The woman would then be paraded through the town, a silent and shamed figure. While these punishments were not usually fatal, they were a powerful way to enforce social norms and control female behavior. When women were sentenced to death, often for murdering a husband, it was sometimes under the charge of petty treason, and the prescribed punishment was often burning, seen as a more modest death than the dismembering reserved for male traitors. These distinctions reveal a society obsessed with order, where a woman's crime was not just against the law, but against her prescribed place in the natural hierarchy. One of the most jarring aspects of medieval justice, to our modern minds, is the staggering lack of proportion between crime and punishment. In a world where survival was a daily struggle, petty theft was rampant. A man might steal a loaf of bread to feed his starving family, or a desperate woman might pilfer a small item from a market. Today, such crimes would likely result in a minor fine or a warning. In the medieval era, they could get you killed. While first-time offenders might be let off with a public shaming in the stocks or a flogging. Repeat offenders, or those who stole from the wrong person, could face branding, mutilation, or the gallows. The logic behind this severity was not about fairness. It was about deterrence and the protection of property, which was intrinsically linked to social status and power. In a rigid, feudal system, property was sacred. A theft, no matter how small, was not just an offense against the victim. It was a challenge to the entire social structure. The authorities believed that only the most terrifying punishments could keep the desperate masses in line. The idea of a punishment fitting the crime was secondary to the need to make a horrific example. This led to a justice system that often seemed cruel and capricious, where a man could lose his life for the value of a few coins, while a nobleman might escape serious consequences for a far greater crime. The value of a human life, particularly a commoner's, was weighed against the value of property and social order, and it was often found wanting. As we look back on this strange and often terrifying world of Victorian medicine, it is easy to judge. It's easy to see the ignorance in bloodletting, the cruelty in the rest cure, or the foolishness in electrotherapy. We can recoil in horror at the thought of heroin-laced syrups for children or surgeons operating with unwashed hands. But if we stop there, we miss a deeper, more profound truth. Beneath all the bizarre theories and brutal practices lay one of the most fundamental and noble of human impulses, the desire to heal. These were not, for the most part, monsters or fools. They were people confronting the immense, terrifying mystery of human suffering with the limited tools they possessed. In an age before the certainty of the germ theory, they were fighting an invisible, shapeless enemy. Their bizarre treatments were not acts of malice, but desperate experiments, attempts to impose order on the chaos of disease. The doctor who prescribed mercury was not trying to poison his patient. He was trying to purge a sickness he could not see. The physician who recommended the rest cure genuinely believed he was calming a nervous system he did not understand. Their story is a humbling reminder that knowledge is a privilege of time. They were standing in a dimly lit room, trying to describe a monster with only their sense of touch. We, in our well-lit age of modern science, can see the monster clearly, but their struggle, their relentless, often misguided, and deeply human effort to push back against the darkness of pain and death is a story not of failure, but of profound and enduring hope. It is the story of humanity's unending quest to understand itself and to mend what is broken, even when it has no idea where to begin. And in their failures, we find the second, and perhaps more important, legacy of this bizarre era. The very strangeness of Victorian medicine, its confident application of demonstrably harmful cures, created the conditions for a revolution in thought. Modern, evidence-based medicine was born not from its successes, but from its spectacular and often tragic failures. For every patient who was bled into a state of weakness, for every woman driven to despair by the rest cure, for every child quieted by an opiate-laced syrup, a question was implicitly being asked: is there a better way? The work of figures like John Snow, Joseph Lister, and Robert Koch was so revolutionary precisely because it was a direct challenge to the old way of thinking. They were among the first to insist that medicine should not be based on ancient tradition, gut feeling, or elegant but unproven theories. It should be based on observation, on data, on rigorous, repeatable experiments. The scientific method, which had already transformed fields like physics and chemistry, was finally being brought to the bedside. This was the true dawn of the modern medical age. It was the birth of skepticism, the vital understanding that even the most esteemed expert could be wrong, and that every treatment, no matter how logical it seems, must be tested and proven. The bizarre world of Victorian medicine had to exist so that it could be dismantled. Its strange and terrible cures served as the necessary darkness against which the light of a new, more rational, and more compassionate approach to healing could finally shine. It was a long and painful lesson, paid for by the suffering of countless individuals, but it was a lesson that would ultimately change the course of human history. Imagine now a different kind of room, not the cluttered, dimly lit Victorian sick room, heavy with the scent of carbolic acid and laudanum, but the clean, quiet space of a modern clinic. The light is soft and even. The air is still and sterile, free from the ghosts of miasma and unseen germs. The instruments are not made of wood and brass, kept in velvet-lined boxes, but of polished stainless steel, sealed in sterile packaging. There are no jars of leeches on the shelf, no porcelain heads mapping out faculties of the mind, no electromagnetic belts promising to restore lost vigor. There is only a quiet, calm order. The sounds are not of pain cries or the frantic rasp of a bone saw, but the gentle hum of a computer, the soft beep of a machine, the hushed, reassuring voice of a professional who has spent years in rigorous, standardized training. The knowledge in this room is not based on ancient tradition or speculative theory, but on decades of data, of clinical trials, of a global, collective effort to understand the human body. This quiet, unassuming room is the legacy of the bizarre, chaotic world we have just visited. It is a space built not just of plaster and glass, but of all the hard-won lessons of the past. So, as you rest here, in the quiet of the night, let the bizarre world of Victorian medicine fade into a distant dream. Let it be a strange and gentle lullaby, a story that highlights the profound comfort of the world you now inhabit. The fever you may feel is not a reason for leeches or bleeding bowls. The cough that might trouble you is not a cause for a dose of heroin syrup. The worries of your mind are not a symptom to be silenced by forced isolation. Rest in the quiet confidence of an age built on the strange, and often painful, lessons of the past. Feel the gentle rhythm of your own breathing, steady and calm. Know that you are safe from the surgeon's frantic haste, from the well-intentioned poisons in a bottle, from the cure that was far worse than the disease. The struggles of that era have paved the way for the peace of this one. Let that knowledge be a blanket of comfort. Let the history rest. And now, you can rest too. Sleep well